Recently, I reread Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, and I am on a mission to convince everyone that it is a masterpiece. Hi, my name is Julia, and on this channel, I discuss art, books, and museums. And if you want these things more in your life, then please consider subscribing. So, before I begin, just a small spoiler alert. This video is not a recommendation or review video. I'm going to discuss history of the book, critical interpretations, and plot devices, so unfortunately I can't make this video spoiler-free. If you're just thinking of reading this novel, I can recommend you 3 things. First of all, do read it. If you're here for recommendations, so here it is. Read it, it's a great book. Take your time, pay attention, surrender to Humbert's charm, and see how that makes you think of him and feel. Second, read Introduction to Lolita right after you finish the book. That is crucial in understanding of the plot. And third, consider reading Nabokov's essay on the book entitled Lolita that is usually attached to almost any recent editions of the book as an afterword. That gives you a bare minimum of a story behind the book. So please go do that and then come back to share your opinions and impressions on the book in the comment section below. And promise me that you hit the like button if you learned something new today, okay? Okay, so let's begin. So here's the story. A middle-aged man meets a 12-year-old girl in the park and falls in love with her. He decides to marry her mother just to be near that girl. The mother is sick and soon she dies. He gains full custody and he takes her to a hotel where in the middle of the night he tries to take advantage of her. But she wakes up and starts to scream. In dismay, he escapes the witnesses, he runs out the hotel and is suddenly struck by a truck. So just to clarify, this is not a retelling of Lolita. This is a vague summary of Nabokov's last novel written in Russian, completed 16 years before Lolita in 1939. It was first translated into English by his son Dmitry Nabokov and first published in 1986. The novella is titled The Enchanter, and as you can see from my modest plot summary, it can very much be defined as a precursor of Lolita, and according to the biographer of Nabokov, Brian Boyd, it is a very weak one. In his opinion, it lacks quality and basically has no depth, such as in Lolita. Well, I think Nabokov had the same opinion, that is why he decided not to publish it. But very often indeed, The Enchanter is viewed as a base for Humbert Humbert and Lolita as a whole. But what if I tell you there is even earlier attempts to introduce us this archetype? Maybe the idea is born even earlier on the pages of his novel The Gift, published in 1938. In the 3rd chapter of The Gift, bored head of the family, Shigalov, annoys our main character, Cherdintsev, with the following monologue, and I'm going to read it to you. If only I had a teacup too, what a novel I would whip off. From real life. Imagine this kind of thing. An old dog, but still in his prime, fiery, thirsting for happiness, gets to know a widow, and she has a daughter, still quite a little girl. You know what I mean, when nothing is formed yet, but already she has a way of walking that drives you out of your mind? A slip of a girl, very fair, pale, with blue under the eyes. And of course she doesn't even look at the old goat. What to do? Well, not long thinking, he ups and marries the widow. Okay, they settle down, the 3 of them. Here we can go indefinitely. The temptation, the eternal torment, the itch, the mad hopes, and the upshot in miscalculation. Time flies, he gets older, she blossoms out and not a sausage. Just walks by and squashes you with a look of contempt. Hey, do you feel a kind of Dostoevskian tragedy? That story, you see, happened to a great friend of mine. Once upon a time in a fairyland when old King Cole was a merry old soul. The interesting part is that this character, Shigalov, he describes his own story, because from the book we know that he marries a widowed woman with a little girl. By the time they have this conversation, the girl is a grown-up woman named Zina, and our main character actually falls in love with her. So this little monologue can be considered an embryo of Lolita's plot as well. And that would make Shigalov the embryo of future Humbert Humbert. But it will take another 17 years for Nabokov to actually create the most vivid monster in the literary history. On May 28, 1940, Nabokov and his family board Champlain boat on the way to the United States. Nabokov spent his first 20 years of life in Russia, where he was born to a noble upper-class family. Another 20 years of his life, he escaped revolution and hid in Europe, studying in England, becoming a rising star of an emigre community in Germany, escaping Nazis in France, and frequently visiting his mother in Czechoslovakia. The next 10 years he will spend as an American writer and professor. While living in Berlin, he married a Jewish woman, Vera Slonim. She will become Vera Nabokova, and in the 1930s it was clear that they had to flee Europe as soon as possible. The Jewish refugee charity organization granted Nabokov's first-class tickets for a boat to America as a gratitude for his father's deeds as a defender of Jewish rights in Russian Empire. Through his relatives and emigre connections, he got place to stay in New York, first gigs and short-term positions mainly related to writing and translation. Friends he acquired in this first month in America, among which were the brightest minds of American academia, helped him to land his first one-year contract at the Wellesley College in Massachusetts as a professor of Russian literature. His last years in Europe and his first month in America were quite tough for an emigre family. He didn't earn much with his writing, and when moving to the United States, he faced one simple reality. If he wants to sell books, he has to write in English. But then, he didn't have much trouble to use English. He was a man of an aristocratic pedigree, a son of a liberal Democrat who, from the childhood, would be exposed to European culture and languages. His first governess was English, and his first words were in English. Later in his life, he would study in Cambridge to get his undergraduate degree. He also spoke fluent French and knew a bit of German, although didn't like to speak in it. But of course, Russian language was his great lover and partner, in which he wrote 12 novels, 1 memoir, dozens of short stories, and even more poems. His first novels in English he started to write already in Europe because he understood the imminence of publishing for a wider audience, and not only for a circle of Russian emigres in Europe, but it was one of his biggest tragedies in his life to switch to English. And here I just want to quote Nabokov from one of his unpublished notes. The déménagement from my palatial Russian to the narrow quarters of my English was like moving from one darkened house to another on a starless night during a strife of candle makers and torch bearers. So yeah, well, what was a tragedy for him certainly became a gain for American literature, but it will take him another 2 novels and a delayed publication of Lolita to finally establish himself as an American writer. Now, we have to understand that he spent almost 5 years working on Lolita. It was a difficult task for him, and without his wife Vera, it would not have existed at all, so we have to mention her contribution to the novel as well. There is this famous quote from the writer Jenny Orville: "My plan was to never get married. I was going to be an art monster instead." Women almost never become art monsters, because art monsters only concern themselves with art, never mundane things. Nabokov didn't even fold his umbrella. Vera licked his stems for him. It feels like often there's this misconception that Vera Nabokova was yet another victim of male genius who would only allow his woman to be his muse and supporter, but not partner or independent creator. I would argue that Vera was a key to Nabokov's and Lolita's success. I do believe without her, there wouldn't be Nabokov nor Lolita. And Nabokov stressed that as well.
Well, thank you, darling. It was an absolutely wonderful game.
She did lick his stamps, indeed, but she also corresponded with the publishers, critics, and agents in other countries. She did help him with driving the car around the United States when he was composing Lolita. She did substitute him in the university and conducted lectures on European and Russian literature. But she wasn't just an assistant. She was officially his agent, his editor, and his primary reader. She was also a person who rescued Lolita. Twice Vladimir Nabokov attempted to burn the manuscript, and both of the times Vera fetched the pages from the flames. Once his student, Dirk Kiegan, witnessed the scene. Vera was stomping on the burning pages to put down the fire and shouting to her husband, "Get away from there, we're keeping this," and so they kept it. He finished Lolita in 1953 and sent the manuscript to several prospective American publishing houses. A lot of them confused it with the low-key pornography and autobiographical fantasy. Some feared to be banned immediately in the Puritanic America of the 50s. But it was imperative for the novel to see the light of day. Through some connections in a literary world, he was suggested to ask Olympia Press in Paris to perhaps publish the manuscript. And so in 1955, it was finally out. A side note on Olympia Press. This publishing house had quite a peculiar reputation. They printed in France, but books in English language, usually those that couldn't pass censorship in the UK or the United States for one reason or another. I would argue that Olympia Press epitomized an avant-garde publishing house, printing erotic fiction along with contemporaries like William Burroughs, Samuel Beckett, Henry Miller, and George Bataille, among others. Not bad, huh? Lolita didn't gain an immediate success after her publication, but it sure fell into the right hands, because by the end of the year, English writer Graham Greene pronounced it as one of the best books of 1955. This is the official story of how mass popularity and general interest had reached Lolita. But for literary circles in the United States, Lolita was already a familiar work. At the end of the day, several publishing houses refused to publish it, and they sure knew what they were saying no to. They read it and chose not to publish. But after realizing the artistic merit of the work and the loss of opportunity in terms of money, first American publisher Putnam finally ventured to release the book in its original place of birth. With the success of American publication, Nabokov's received an enormous amount of requests to translate and publish Lolita, as well as an invitation to Hollywood and offer from Stanley Kubrick to adapt the book for screen. With that came an international fame and demand on Nabokov's earlier works. Without a doubt, Lolita launched a new page of Nabokov's career, and it felt as justice has finally prevailed and an obscure émigré author finally became a true sensation. I was reading Lolita on the subway on the way home, and a young man sitting next to me noticed that I'm reading something, so he took out his headphones and asked me, "What are you reading?" And I said, "Lolita by Nabokov. Ever heard of it?" To my horror, he shrugs and says, "Nein. What is it about?" Now, all of it is happening in Germany and in German, and my German is very basic. I can communicate my daily work, I can chat about the weekend plans and past vacations, but never have I ever asked to explain what Lolita is about to a complete stranger. I immediately realized the irony, because it is probably one of the most difficult books to describe to a stranger without sounding like a crazy maniac. So I mumbled something like, "Oh, it's about this pedophile who is a total monster, and we're reading his unreliable narration and we believe him, and blah blah blah." After my miserable attempt to describe this unforgiving book, the gentleman said, "Oh, viel Spaß damit," put his headphones back and got out of the subway train. And look, I don't blame him for avoiding my company because of my incohesive German or my poor description of a book, but I was actually surprised that he didn't know the book from the first place, because I thought it's something like of a common knowledge. But that story aside, it is a good question we should ask ourselves. What is Lolita about? For preparation to this video, I have watched almost every video on Lolita here on YouTube to see how this book is perceived in our little book community. Some booktubers have managed to make a short summary of a book for us viewers to understand the context a little bit, but in my humble opinion, with all due respect to these creators, all of these summaries harm our perception. That doesn't mean that the reviews and opinions are bad. This is not what I'm saying. Please go watch all of them if you want to see different perspectives. It seems like Lolita is one of those books that cannot be retold, because it does matter when and how in the book we learn about certain aspects of the main character. It does matter that we learn the prehistory of Humbert Humbert, and only then we are moved to the crucial part of him meeting Dolores and her mother. It does matter that we knew it's going to happen anyways because of that famous first paragraph. And this is what his biographer Boyd calls the reversed detective story. You wouldn't attempt a retelling of a detective story, would you? Anyways, I personally decided not to make any summaries because I know I would fail in it, just as I failed to explain that man what I was reading. But I do want to answer this question. And hey, if you're that man from the subway, or if you just want to learn what this book is about, then keep watching, and I'm going to give explanation and interpretations of various respectful intellectuals, and maybe at the end of the video I will also give my own interpretation of the novel. So yeah, keep watching. When asked how he came up with the idea to write his book, Nabokov had a ready-made answer.
Well, let's get down to the really intriguing point, Mr. Nabokov. What gave you the idea for Lolita, the story of a middle-aged man and a 12-year-old girl and their love affair?
Yes, yes.
How did you start it?
Well, in a little afterpiece which I have to my book, I talk about a certain ape who was taught to use charcoal and to sketch the bar. And the first thing that the poor little animal did was to sketch the bars of its own cage. You see.
Is this an analogy?
Yes, I read that story in a newspaper, and if I try to rationalize the impact of that image, I would say that my baboon, Humbert Humbert, because after all, Humbert Humbert is a baboon of genius perhaps, but a baboon, is doing exactly that, you see. He's drawing and shading and erasing and redrawing the bars of his cage, the bars between him and what he terms the human herd.
That is the explanation he had also given in his afterword to Lolita. So for the author himself, it is a study in a human blinded by his passion and forbidden love. Indeed, through those bars we rarely hear the voice of Dolores. The unfolding tragedy is almost never in focus. For those who anticipated to read a story of a little nymphet that breaks man's heart will quickly find out that it is not what this book is about. So is this a book about Humbert's monstrousness then? Well, yes, but that would mean Nabokov barely left his comfort zone. In his other novel, called Despair, the protagonist plots the cold-blooded murder of an innocent human. He is also blinded, but not by passion though, but by his delusion, his misbelief that that other person is his doppelganger. Almost all of Nabokov's earlier characters are vicious wrongdoers and unsympathetic cheaters. In this sense, Humbert fits perfectly as yet another monster in Nabokov's panopticon. But the interviewer of that TV show picks up the following idea.
It is not a book so much about an aberration as about an actual love, and a love that makes all the terrible demands that almost any love makes, certainly that any sexual love makes, but that is very full of tenderness and very full of compassion as well as passion.
Indeed, one of the most common yet eerie interpretations I encountered is that it is a love story. Unconventional, forbidden, but a love story nonetheless. And as an evidence, people refer to one particular moment in the book, and I'm going to read it to you right now. By the way, I used this Penguin Modern Classic Edition, but I also put the chapter number on the screen so you can also follow if you want. So the excerpt is towards the end when he's visiting Lolita, who's 17 years old already and who's pregnant with a baby from another man. So it's page 277, 278. So there she was, with her ruined looks, and her adult, rope-veined narrow hands, and her goose-flesh white arms, and her shallow ears, and her unkempt armpits. There she was, my Lolita, hopelessly worn at 17, without baby, dreaming already in her of becoming a big shot and retiring around 2020 AD. And I looked and looked at her, and knew as clearly as I know I am to die, that I loved her more than anything I had ever seen or imagined on earth, or hoped for anywhere else. So I'm gonna skip a bit here. I insist the world to know how much I love my Lolita, this Lolita, pale and polluted, and big with another child, but still grey-eyed, still sooty-lashed, still auburn and almond, still Carmencita, still mine. Changeons d'avis, ma Carmen, allons vivre quelque part en nous, ne serons jamais séparés. Ohio, the wilds of Massachusetts, no matter, even if those eyes of hers would fade to myopic fish, and her nipples swell and crack, and her lovely young velvety delicate delta be tainted and torn, even then I would go mad with tenderness at the mere sight of your dear wan face, at the mere sound of your gracious young voice, my Lolita. So this outburst is unusual in many ways. At the end of the book, we know Humbert as a person who always eloquently expresses himself, poetically describes landscapes, mixes his English with a pinch of French, and quotes great works of art. Suddenly, he explodes in this cliched promise for infinite love, vaguely resembling the marriage vows, like, I will love you no matter what, in sickness and health, when you're no longer young, beautiful. That is indeed so unlike him, but any reader who paid attention will not be 100% convinced in his confession. Because here on the page 148, he says, "Mentally, I found her to be a disgustingly conventional little girl." Okay, is that what people think of their beloved ones? All right. On the page 167, he says, "But the fog was like a wet blanket, and the sand was gritty and clammy, and law was all goose flesh and greed, and for the first time in my life, I've had a little desire for her as for a manatee." Okay, so in certain circumstances, he is not attracted to her at all. Interesting. Or take, for instance, the episode on page 161, where he forced her to sit with him and let him caress her while he was watching other girls passing by. That proves, of course, that Lolita was not a lone object of his desire. It proves that he is the monster in his definition of love is perverted, and he only needs her because of his fantasy of her that sometimes does not coincide with reality, with real Dolores Hayes. And the most disturbing one is, in my opinion, on page 174, where he is getting tired of her more and more, and he's fantasizing of getting rid of Dolores because he knows she will eventually grow up and stop being an infant. So he adds, "To the thought that with the patience and luck, I might have her produce eventually an infant with my blood in her exquisite veins, a Lolita II, who would be 8 or 9 around 1960, when I would still be dans la fosse de l'âge." Excuse me? That is absolutely sick. Everyone who actually read those lines would be immediately scandalized to the point of a full and unconditional support for a little girl, and immediately would be convinced that this is a destructive and arrogant love. He does not take into account her feelings at all. We see more and more moments of Humbert being aggressive and egoistic towards a poor child, yet we call it love?
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
For Boyd, his aforementioned biographer, for instance, that was a signal of character development. He thinks that Humbert's madness at the end and his sincere confession should change our perception of a character, and as if we should immediately believe Humbert and his feelings. Well, sorry, but I'm not sold to this interpretation, and I do believe that for Humbert to switch to a simple language with no satire and no superfluous vanity, well, almost, and a little bit of French, it was an actual trick. From the page 1, we know of his deeds, and from the page 1, he tries to justify his actions. I can imagine that especially sensitive readers can succumb to his rubbish. It is as if Nabokov was testing our moral compass, although he never actually expressed this intention. Look, we can stay here forever just to discuss the definition of love, and that when critics talk about love, they always mean something else. It's just they call it love for a lack of a better word. I know, I get it. I too don't have a single right definition of love, but I do believe that we treat love differently in the 21st century in comparison to even the previous one. We take into consideration the power, the privilege, the equality or inequality in the human relationships. But here's the beauty of Lolita. It doesn't stop to be a masterpiece as time goes and our perception of love changes, because there is more to it than just an unconventional love story. Lolita is truly timeless. It's just some interpretations of her aged badly. But no worries, some great minds came up with more interesting interpretations, and let's talk about them. Take, for instance, Anna Brodsky and her essay Nabokov's Lolita and the Post-War Emigre Consciousness. She proposes to take into account the historical context in which the book was written and published. In her opinion, Humbert Humbert is a character who makes sense only in the wake of the 20th century Holocaust. As I mentioned earlier, before Lolita, Nabokov created some of the most loathsome characters in literary history. And Brodsky believes that he took Humbert's malice to the extreme, because the world itself was wicked, broken, and corrupted. She also reminds us that Nabokov and his family were also victims of these tragic events. Indeed, Nabokov's mother, Yelena, at the time lived in Prague and was in a dire state of health. When Hitler annexed Czechoslovakia in 1938, she lost her pension and couldn't support herself. Nabokov couldn't help her either because his financial situation was, as he describes, catastrophic at the time. He couldn't send her money nor attend her funeral when she died in 1939. A little later, his brother Sergei Nabokov and his good friend Ilya Fandaminsky both died in the concentration camps. Anna Brodsky paid our attention to the fact that the plot takes place at the end of the Second World War. She doesn't compare Humbert to the Nazi states, she only suggests that the terror of the 30s and 40s gave Nabokov full reign of creating his most villainous character. Azar Nafisi, for example, a celebrated Iranian author, in her book Reading Lolita in Tehran, suggests that through this novel, Nabokov showcased everyone who ever took advantage of another person. Yet the novel, the finished work, is hopeful, beautiful even. A defense not just of beauty but of life, ordinary life, all the normal pleasures that Lolita, like Yassi, was deprived of. I added that in fact Nabokov had taken revenge against our own solipsizers. He had taken revenge on Ayatollah Khomeini, on Yassi's last suitor, on the dough-faced teacher for that matter. They had tried to shape others according to their own dreams and desires, but Nabokov, through his portrayal of Humbert, had exposed all solipsists who take over other people's lives. I think if we only see Humbert Humbert as an unapologetic abuser, then it's easy for us to use him as a metaphor to any other abuser. But it's interesting how she stresses later in that chapter that Humbert does not equal Ayatollah Khomeini. In fact, further, she suggests a very beautiful interpretation. In her opinion, Dolores Hayes is Humbert's half-alive butterfly that is pinned to the wall. Now, we have to remember that Nabokov was actually a successful amateur lepidopterologist. Part of his own collection is now in the American Museum of Natural History, where he actually briefly worked, volunteered for some time upon his arrival to the United States. He never actually suggested to compare Dolores with the butterfly, but I do like Nafisi's explanation. It creates this Nabokov's personal touch that he always denies. It also captures this desire of Humbert Humbert to stop the time, to freeze it in that moment when Dolores is still a child, where she doesn't change and doesn't get old, where she is a perfect picture of his memories of Annabel Lee. So look, I have no literary degree in English or any other language, and that is why I have watched 3 lectures on Lolita uploaded on YouTube by the Yale University. And if you want to learn more on how Nabokov utilizes certain literary forms and how he builds bridges with another modernist of that time, I strongly recommend you watch them too. 2 of the lectures conducted by the Professor Amy Hungerford, and 1 lecture I particularly enjoyed was by Professor Andrew Goldstone. Funnily enough, the Andrew Goldstone's lecture is not titled as a lecture on Lolita, so I think people don't find it easily, but now you know it from me. Please go watch them. Anyways, I'm not going to talk much about the forms and literary devices because, again, there are better people for this task out in the world. I just want to stress some of the observations and perhaps add mine too. First of all, we've already mentioned how Lolita's plot could be related to the historical context. I think we can also judge the form of the novel by the literary trends of that time. You don't really need to have a PhD in literature to notice that Nabokov experiments with the text. Chapter 11, in the first part, for example, is written as his diary. And some chapters he begins by addressing the jury, which is us, as if he was making a plea in a court. He also includes poems in Lolita, and one of them is particularly important, the one he wrote for Quilty and made him read it right before punishment. It was supposed to be pompous accusation, yet it was ruthlessly ridiculed by Quilty and made the whole scene a complete farce. But it was kind of a revenge on Humbert, because in the beginning of the novel, Humbert mentions that he wrote pastiches, which is satirical imitation of works of others, and indeed, in this little poem, he picks on T.C. Eliot, no less. There are elements of various genres: road trip, romance, satire, plain comedy, and detective story, and of course drama. But all the critics I mentioned before, and the ones I didn't mention, all agree on one thing: that Lolita is foremost a fairy tale. Their first meeting, he compares himself with the fairy tale nurse who would recognize the lost child. And in a sense, Humbert was in his fairy tale. He finally found his lost Annabelle. The most obvious reference to a fairy tale, I think, in the title of the first hotel where he raped Dolores, the Enchanted Hunter. The name of it, of course, is not the only magical coincidence. Quilty miraculously appears in the same hotel the same night, and the number of the room is the same as her home address. But in the whole novel, there are a lot of things that were unexpected and unexplainable. In Nabokov's biography, Brian Boyd notes how fate plays a huge role in Lolita. Fate decides for Humbert what happens next, and not Humbert himself. He didn't kill Charlotte Hayes. She was killed in a terrible accident. His plan to drug and rape Dolores failed, and she actually advanced on him. Even if he was thinking to get rid of Dolores, she escaped him first. And of course, when Humbert offers Dolores the whole life together, his unconditional love and escape from her husband, she refuses. Even small details, such as when he put Dolores to the school and decided to stay in that town for a while because from their house he had a nice view on the school where he would, watch young girls. But soon the constructors came and built a huge fence, and there were a wonderful view no more. Nothing goes according to his plan. He's constantly humiliated by his destiny. He's basically a loser. Boyd also suggests that the final scene of Humbert killing Quilty is actually his attempt to take control over his life. And Quilty is merely his reflection, the projection of Humbert's scenes, because he is too a child molester. That is actually also another common theme in Nabokov's oeuvre. I already mentioned novel Despair, where the protagonist is preoccupied with the doppelganger. There were also a lot of mirrors and reflections in that novel. His lesser-known novella, The Eye, some people interpret as a story of one person, despite the fact that we actually read about two separate characters. So this polarization of the characters is very common in Nabokov's works, so I readily accept the Boyd's explanation. By carefully constructing the plot, Nabokov created the trap for a little girl, Dolores, but also a trap for Humbert. Maybe this is what he meant when he talked about the bars of a cage. No matter how masterful Nabokov's fairy tale is, for some people it's a cruel reality. In 1948, America was shook by the news of Sally Horner's kidnapping. An 11-year-old girl was deceived and abducted by a 51-year-old child molester Frank LaSalle. Till today, there are a lot of speculations of whether Nabokov told Sally's story without her or her mother's consent. One of such examples is the investigation of Sarah Weinman in her book The Real Lolita. Weinman notes that Nabokov mentioned Sally Horner in Lolita, and it is true, in chapter 33, page 289. Had I done to Dolly perhaps what Frank LaSalle, a 50-year-old mechanic, had done to 11-year-old Sally Horner in 1948? Weinman suggests that Nabokov took her story as a base for Lolita, despite the fact that Nabokov denied this assumption. Apart from Nabokov mentioning the case in Lolita, Weinman's only evidence is that among all the research papers related to the book, that Vera carefully collected and preserved, by the way, there were nothing on Horner's case. It seemed too suspicious for Weinman, but I truly can't see any discrepancy here. If you've ever done a research, you know that some information can get lost or forgotten or just overlooked easily. And even if the archive had a couple of newspaper clippings of Sally's abduction, that still wouldn't prove the theft of the story. It seemed to me that this book wanted to make the hypothesis true so bad, it was ready to defend the weakest arguments. In my eyes, by doing that, the author only harmed herself. If she would stick to Sally's Hornet tragic life and the criminal investigation only, without trying to make a literary investigation, I would respect this book more. I'm really surprised how swift we people are to find one obvious connection between an artwork and the reality, and how persistent we are to find the proof for our assumptions. But of course, I don't know either whether Lolita was based at least partially on Sally's Hornet's case. Nobody can know for sure. And I would argue that Nabokov didn't know that either. I would argue that the most striking thing about this book is how close it is in description of a monster like Humbert. One of the reasons I reread Lolita recently is that we selected it for the book club in July. During our meeting, one of our members reported that a good friend of his was unfortunate to experience these atrocities in her life. She told him that, in her opinion, Humbert has thoughts and justifications exactly that of a real pedophile. It was difficult for her to read the book exactly because of this reason, and I can't imagine what she might feel, and I do agree that no one should torture themselves by going through the difficult book. But I can imagine how this realistic description could lead astray some people into thinking that Nabokov himself was a child molester. One thing Lolita did to the whole body of work of Nabokov is to make readers discern that indeed it is a recurrent subject in his books. We have already mentioned the Enchanter who seduces the little girl. There is also this novel called Laughter in the Dark, where the main character falls in love with a 16-year-old girl, and actually who in English translation made by Nabokov himself became a 17-year-old. There's a 12-year-old Emma in Invitation to a Beheading, which, although has no intimate relationship with the main character, she bears a certain symbolic meaning of purity, freedom, and perhaps desired discharge of a prisoner. Almost in all of his books and in some short stories, there is a minor girl or boy who captures the author's and reader's attention. So some people tend to make this conclusion that Nabokov had interest in underage girls. There is no biographical proof, however. His personal life is very well studied. We know of one accident of his infidelity, but he ended the relationship for the sake of Vera and their family. At the end of the day, she was his true and only love. From reading his biography, to me, he makes an impression of a sophisticated intellectual, the definition of high class, but judging not by the size of their real estate or the quality of their clothes, but by their education and their priorities. But it does leave us with the question, why then Nabokov includes all these little girls in his novels? And I couldn't find an answer, so I decided to make my own conclusions. We see how some people approach this novel strictly as a piece of art, but it is hard indeed to believe in the power of art only when it is so close to the reality. So we come up with all these possible explanations of how Lolita is related to Nabokov on the personal level. Well, I think he managed to kill two birds with one stone. I applaud all the scholars who managed to decipher all the references to the modernists, and I truly appreciate their analytical work. But I want to talk about the impression I had, the feelings and not logic. I've read Nabokov's memoir, Speak Memory, that he published even before Lolita, but already after he moved to the United States. To my surprise, he ignored a lot of crucial information about, for example, his brothers and sisters. Or he interrupts his narrative when he leaves Russia and doesn't continue with his time in Europe. But what he has a lot in this book is the description of his early childhood. He speaks with the utmost tenderness and gentleness about his teachers and his first butterfly hunts, his home and his early memories of his parents. The places he describes in Speak Memory don't exist anymore. Of course, there is the house of his family in St. Petersburg, which still stands and which is now Vladimir Nabokov Museum. Or there's this villa he inherited when he was just 17 years old, which also became a museum in his name. But other estates he frequented in his childhood were destroyed. His inheritance was, of course, confiscated and occupied by the Soviet Party. His father was killed in Berlin by the right-wing monarchist when Nabokov was just 22 years old. He was displaced several times, and only once he moved by his own will when he moved to Switzerland as a celebrated author. I don't want to psychoanalyze Nabokov, also because he would hate it. He hated Freud and his studies.
Mr. Nabokov, would you tell us why it is you detest Dr. Freud?
Well, I think he's crude. I think he's medieval. And I don't want an elderly gentleman from Vienna with an umbrella inflicting his dreams upon me.
But in a lot of his works, there is a nostalgia about the past, about the old world he lived in, about the world he had to leave when he was just 18. So it seems that childhood and early adolescence is a very sensitive and yet definitive and even sacred period of everybody's life, according to Nabokov. And if so, then people like Humbert are the destroyers, the most horrible types of monsters. But just like Azar Nafisi, I don't want to compare Humbert to Russian revolutionaries, and I don't want to get political about it at all. Because Humbert is always different. Humbert is the one who, as Azar Nafisi puts, confiscates the individual's life. Just for Nabokov and for many people in the world, the undoubtful and unquestionable monsters are the ones who steal your childhood. If we just read Lolita once again very carefully, we'll start to notice that the majority of victims in this book are children. And Dolores is not the only one. Annabel Lee, for instance, his first true love, dies in her childhood. Dolores' brother had died when he was little, I think 2 or something like that. And this, of course, could have been a huge tragedy for the whole Hayes family. On page 157, when Humbert recites all the tourist destinations they visited in America, among all the geographical and natural wonders, there is one museum exhibit, and it is a mummy of a child. The barber, on page 213, tells about his dead child, but Humbert was too arrogant to realize it. And finally, Dolores herself and her child under her heart. But those moments are hidden. They are not in the book to scare us or create suspense. It is a suppressed reality in which Humbert and Dolores live. Meanwhile, in our reality, we may conclude that Lolita is based on Silas Horner's tragedy as much as on the tragedy of every little human ever victimized and used by dangerous predators and every child who passed too early. And that is why it resonates and scandalizes people till this day. But I do believe that the book Lolita does not deprive the real stories, such as Sally's, of their own significance. And as for responsible reader, we have to know the classics, and we have to look out and prevent some of the fairy tales from happening. Hey, thank you very much for watching. Just wanted to add that this book and Nabokov's life is a real rabbit hole of articles, books, and interpretations. I haven't even discussed the so-called unreliable narration and how and when it is used in the book. I also wanted to talk about where in the book we can actually see and find Dolores Hayes. I think she is a fascinating character and she is masterfully hidden from the readers. We know that for Nabokov, she and Benin were his most favorite characters he created, so that speaks volume, I guess. But really, I could continue for another hour of a video, but I think my computer wouldn't be able to process such a long content. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed it. I definitely enjoyed making it. It took me a good 2 months to prepare for it, along my full-time job and several reading projects at once. So I would really appreciate if you like the video, especially if you learned something new. And if you would like more content like that, please let me know in the comment and subscribe. And yes, I will hopefully see you in the next video very, very soon. Bye.